Hello, welcome to part 3 in our series. Today we're going to talk about pesticides. And I think they're one of the biggest environmental threats to everyone today. And we're going to get into that, and we'll come at the end, we'll talk about simple things you can do. I think the big lie is that we've heard from pesticide companies for decades is they help us feed the world. You know, like the chemical companies like to tell us, we feed the world. They do anything but that when you actually look at the facts. Since 1940, the use of pesticides in the world has 10 times. That's 1,000% increase. Okay. At the same time, insects have doubled in population. So this is not something that is helping us feed the world or get rid of bugs. Okay. It does help chemical companies make money. One of the things you have to look at is pesticides when they're sprayed to crops and agriculture. They kill everything. Side means to kill. A guy once said that to me. It's so true. Side means to kill. So when you spray pesticides on crops, you're killing in the soil all the nutrients and microorganisms that help make topsoil. Now, I mean, I'm not a farmer, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that our topsoil is a very delicate infrastructure on our planet. You only have so many feet of it in certain parts of the planet, and that's how we feed the entire world, by growing things in topsoil. And so the nature of topsoil, its health, its care, its depth is very important. The Stanford University did a study and says we're losing 10 times more topsoil every year in this country than we're regaining or refurbishing. So we're losing valuable feet of topsoil in this country, and a lot of that comes from the overuse of chemicals on our topsoil that kills the microorganisms that make it. Since 1940, every pesticide that's been conceived, and the birth of the modern pesticide was around 1940s, maybe a little earlier. And since the birth of modern pesticides in 1940, every pesticide that's been approved as okay or safe to use has eventually been proven unsafe to use. It's like a 1-for-1 batting average. So this stuff that's designed to kill living things is not safe to you or the environment. And I think that's important for you to understand. I think that the concept of a safe pesticide is literally an oxymoron. There's nothing safe about these things. These are pesticides that you might buy in the grocery store or the supermarket or the pharmacy to kill bugs in your homes. There is nothing safe about these pesticides. These things are very dangerous. Now, I don't want you to live with bugs and cockroaches and everything else. I'm going to go into that in a little bit. But this is a no-no. You don't do it. USC did a study in the LA area years ago. And what they did is they took 1,500 homes. And half the homes used a pesticide like store-bought, like we're talking about, like Black Flag or Raid. And half the homes used none for a period of 2 years. In the homes that use these common store-bought pesticides that you, the consumer, thinks, well, it's on a grocery shelf, it's safe. In those homes, there was a 400% to 500% increase in childhood leukemias compared to the homes that use no pesticides over a 2-year period. UC Davis just recently did a study, again showing an increase in childhood leukemias from the pesticide use that children are being exposed to in food, in their schools, schoolyard, and parks. This is a major problem in the United States, the increase in childhood leukemia, and it's been linked by clear scientific studies to the increased use of pesticides in the home. One thing that you ought to know, I think most people don't, which is important in order to protect yourself, is we often think, well, the Environmental Protection Agency, they test all this stuff, right? They're not going to approve something to use in my home that could be harmful to me. Well, it's not really done that way. The U.S. EPA tests nothing. Okay, they rely on the industry, the people who make this stuff, to do safety studies internally in their own way, and then present those studies to the EPA for approval. So the EPA looks at it and goes, okay, looks good, looks fine, and approves it. So it's sort of like the fox is watching the chicken house. This is where there's a gap in our laws and our procedures that allow these kinds of things to get through, only to find years later that they cause harm and get banned. This is Roundup. This is the largest weed killer pesticide in the history of the planet. It's been made since 1940, and it's been used on plants and all over the world by agriculture to kill weeds. And it's been sold and touted as safe. It's made by Monsanto, who recently was purchased and is now owned by Bayer. Roundup is not safe. The International Research Agency on Cancer found a few years ago that Roundup, the active ingredient in it, glyphosate, is its active ingredient in Roundup, is a probable human carcinogen. That doesn't mean like 51% maybe, it's like more 80 to 90%. It's a probable human carcinogen. How did that happen? Well, again, Monsanto early on did studies on glyphosate and Roundup, and those studies they presented to the EPA, who then approved it. Okay, on investigation, we find a couple of things about Roundup that really is important to you to know. First, it was first invented, the chemical glyphosate was first used as a boiler cleaner, an industrial cleaner. And what that means is they would take this chemical and spray it on inside of big, large aluminum metal tanks to descale them, take the calcium deposits that build up in water tanks and so forth over years and clean those calcium deposits out. It's very similar to the chemical you use to remove calcium deposits on your faucet or your shower head. And it did that very well. About 1940 or so, Monsanto's Dr. John Franz, in doing research looking for a weed killer, found that glyphosate killed weeds. And so it was then patented by Monsanto as a weed killer and brought into production and use all over the world. Roundup, because it's originally the active ingredient of glyphosate is a descaler, okay, likes to grab onto and chelate, what we call chelate, grab onto, claw minerals. That's why it works. Anyway, so it's used all over the world, millions and millions of pounds of this all over the world on every food crop. Now you might say, well, that's why I eat organic, because I don't want all those pesticides and herbicides and weed killers on my food that I eat. And that's a good thing, by the way. We'll talk about that a little later. But even organic food, often they use Roundup, glyphosate on. And why? Well, what happens, let's say I'm an organic wheat farmer in North Dakota or Canada. And I have to wait till that wheat or alfalfa or barley starts to get a little brown. Okay, starts to die a little bit in the fall or in the spring whenever I'm harvesting, because the wheat, the grass feed has to be more brittle in order for it to harvest it. So that's what farmers have done for thousands of years. What they discovered is if you spray Roundup on that wheat or alfalfa or barley just a few weeks earlier than harvest time, it will brown the wheat, the alfalfa, the barley sooner, and the farmer can harvest earlier and get the next crop in the ground. So it's economics. And because that Roundup is applied to the grain at harvest time, it's not considered something that violates the organic certification. So the Environmental Working Group did a study. They looked at all sorts of foods, cereals, granola bars, and so on, both organic and non-organic cereals, from Frosted Flakes to Wheaties to Quaker Oats, and so on. And they found glyphosate in literally every one of those foods. Now, I will say they did find less concentrations of glyphosate in foods that were grown organically, rather than foods that have been had Roundup sprayed around it all during the growing season to kill weeds. But it's basically in everything you're eating. Now, you can go online and find glyphosate-free organic grains. You can find them. And if you just Google them, you'll find them, and that's what I do to order. And I order them online. But what does that mean? Well, so you're eating glyphosate. What do we know? Well, in Europe, when this was in a controversy a few years ago, the European Union wanted to extend the permit of using Roundup, but there was now a lot of controversy. Well, could it cause cancer and so forth? And so 39 parliament members in the European Union said, well, we want to get rid of this problem. This is not a problem. We'll do a urine test and we'll check ourselves. We're not farmers. We don't use this stuff at home and show that it's not a population problem. So 39 parliament members submitted urine samples, and when the samples came back, they all had glyphosate in their urine at higher than safe concentrations that were considered safe in humans, and higher than you would find in drinking water. So this stuff is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and it's not good for you. Now, what does that have to do with cancer? Well, think about it. The kind of cancer that Roundup is most associated with is a form of blood cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Okay, and that's typical. It's a disease that you look for, particularly in agricultural workers who use a lot of pesticides and weed killers. And in fact, it has been shown by the International Research Association of Cancer and subsequent studies to increase the likelihood of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I know a lot more about this than I probably should, because my son was the attorney who a few years ago brought the first case against Monsanto on Roundup in court in San Francisco. And he had a client who worked as a maintenance worker killing weeds at a Benicia school district in Northern California for years. And he had various accidents with it. He took a lot of precautions, but a suit failed and it leaked all over him. A pump burst and he had to go and put it out, and he got sprayed with it. And he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and in fact was dying of it. And so it went to trial. My son was his lead attorney, and he proved in a unanimous jury decision, the jury agreed that the Roundup and the exposure to it caused his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And they awarded my son's client $285 million. Subsequently, about a year later, he led the second suit, a man and a woman who had used Roundup on their 4 properties all over Northern California for years. Both came down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now think about that. That's genetically unrelated 2 people coming down with the same disease. That's much less likely than getting hit by lightning. And so again, in a unanimous jury decision, they found that the use of Roundup had caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and awarded $2.1 billion. Okay, so now what does that have to do with you and glyphosate? So basically, you can look at almost any human today in this country, and you can find glyphosate in their body, often at levels that are beyond even what's safe in drinking water. How's that happen, and what does that mean? Well, go back to what I said earlier. Glyphosate likes metals, minerals. It likes particularly calcium. And so when it enters your body through food, through fruit, vegetables, whatever, it has, whatever you're eating that has it on it, cereals and what have you, it goes to the calcium in your body. And where is that? Your bone. Okay? And where does non-Hodgkin lymphoma start? The bone, because it's a blood cancer. So this is a chemical that you really want to avoid and not use in your home. So people ask me, I had a friend call me not too long ago, just a week ago, and goes, I got all these weeds growing out of my driveway. I don't want them to destroy my driveway. What do I do? You can kill weeds the good old-fashioned way by pulling them. Okay, I've always told people if you take salt water and spray them, it'll kill the weeds. But you can buy concoctions like this Burnout at Home Depot or Ace Hardware, and basically it's made out of citric acid and rosemary oil and cedar oil. So safe substances that aren't going to kill you or your dogs or your pets or anything like that, or add to pollution on your property, and you can kill weeds safely. Now you might say, well, these pesticides, I'm spending a bit of time on them in this series. It's so important you understand the risk and what we know in science about them. Probably what's considered by many as the birth of the modern environmental movement was a book written in the 1960s by a biologist out of Tufts and Harvard. Her name was Rachel Carson, and she wrote a book called Silent Spring. And Rachel was an interesting woman. She was a biologist and a teacher at Harvard and Tufts, but in her summertime, what she loved to do is in New England, is she would go and watch birds, and bird populations migrate. That's what she was, a bird watcher. She loved to do it. And I'm glad she did, because what she noted as a bird watcher, that whole populations and species of birds that she had tracked for years were vanishing, or their populations were going really low, and she went, what's going on here? And when she discovered a couple of the species that were looking like going extinct, a few nests, she found that the eggshells of offspring were cracked and broken. So something was interfering with the bird's ability to to successfully procreate. She got curious, and because she was a biologist, she took those shells back to the lab and she analyzed them. And she found them loaded with a pesticide called DDT, also made by Monsanto, starting in about 1930. And the DDT was interfering with the bird population's ability to procreate. And so she went on and researched and studied, and she wrote the book, Silent Spring, in the 1960s, and that was really considered the birth of the modern environmental movement. Because what she noted in the book, and it's a great read, and she's so eloquent, anybody can read it. You don't have to be a biologist to understand it. It's really written in a clear, understanding text. And she says these chemicals are not just affecting the animal population, they're affecting the human populations. Why? Because they build up in the environment over time. And let me read you a passage of what she said here, which I think is very telling. She says, the fact that a suburbanite is not instantly stricken has little meaning, for the toxins may sleep long in the body to become manifest months or years later in an obscure disorder almost impossible to trace to its origins. What's she saying there? She's saying that these chemicals build up in the body, primarily the human fat tissue. The analogy I like to give is think of the lint trap in your clothes dryer that never gets cleaned out. They build up over time in that fat tissue and stay there. So let's take an example. Let's say today I'm a rancher in Chile and I raise cattle and I buy DDT from the chemical companies in the U.S. who still make it, but they can't sell it in the U.S. They ship it to third world countries. And I spray the DDT on the grain that I feed my cattle, to kill the bugs. So I spray the grain, I feed the cattle that grain with DDT on it every day for 4 years. As I feed that grain, the cow can break down the grain, absorb the nutrients, pass out the waste. It can't break down this man-made chemical DDT. So it goes to its only oil-based tissue in its body, it's fat tissue. It's lint trap. And so as I feed that cow over years, it gets higher and higher in DDT. And then at 4 years of age, I slaughter it. And you and I eat it at Wendy's or Burger King. I don't anymore, but you do. It's literally coming up the food chain, and we're the end of the food chain. No one eats us. And it goes into our body, and it builds up in our fat tissue. And we call that in science toxic bioaccumulation. Now, if it was just DDT, we wouldn't have to talk about it. But there are probably 30 pesticides, termicides, killing termites, weed killers, and so forth, that have built up in our body over years. And we'll talk more about that in the final part in this series on detoxification. But I just wanted to get you an idea that this legacy is something that literally and figuratively sticks with us. When a pesticide is banned in the United States, do these chemical companies simply magnanimously stop making them? No. They sell them to countries that don't have our environmental laws. Where do many of our fruits and vegetables come from, particularly in the winter months? Central America, South America. We get our bad karma back. This is called the circle of poison. Estimates have that as many as 100,000 truckloads of food comes in from the southern border every day. We test less than 1% of all those trucks. So there's no way our government is able to monitor those banned pesticides coming back to us in our food. This is a real problem. Okay, now we're going to talk about simple, inexpensive things you can do to reduce your risk to pesticides. We talked about alternates to weed killers like Roundup. Let's talk about some simple things you can do. The first thing I'd like to tell you is eat organic. Okay, now I'm going to do a whole series in part 7 about food. Okay, and diet. So we'll cover this in much more detail. But simply the first thing you can do to protect yourself is eat organic fruits, vegetables, meats whenever you can, because you're reducing the amount of pesticides you're exposed to. Now, what do you do about ants? Well, ants, I don't want you to live with cockroaches and ants and everything else. So what do you do about these? Well, if you have ants in your home, the best thing to do is find out how those suckers are coming in your house, okay? And caulk the baseboard or the cracks, how they're getting in. Keep the counters and surface areas clean, okay? That will do a lot to reduce ants. If you still have ants, there's something you can do. This is what you can do. Go to the garden store and buy a couple of mint plants. They smell great. and put one in the kitchen, one in the living room, maybe one on the deck, wherever you're seeing ants, and you will never see ants again, because ants hate the smell of mint. They hate the smell of it, okay? And you'll have free tea. So that's a simple thing, very inexpensive, environmentally sound that you can do to reduce ants in your home. Cockroaches. Everybody hates those suckers. Cockroaches like warm, dark, wet places. So under laundry sinks, under kitchen sinks that maybe have a leak. First thing you do is have the landlord come in, yourself, a plumber, fix the leak, dry those areas out. Okay? If you still have cockroaches, there's a simple thing you can do without poisoning yourself. This is what you do. You buy boric acid. You can buy it at the hardware store. It's a powder kind of form. This will kill cockroaches and not harm you. Okay, so simple combination of boric acid. Sometimes I mix it with a little granulated sugar because it really grabs the cockroaches. They get to it right away. And that will kill all the cockroaches you have in your home. And a lot less expensive than buying these pesticides that can potentially harm you. Spiders and termites. We all hate spiders and termites, and what can you do other than using chemicals? Well, there's some simple, safe things you can do that cost you actually less money. Voila. So these are all safe, natural solutions that will kill spiders and termites and other insects, made out of citric oil, cinnamon oil, cedar oils, rosemary oil, and they will kill spiders and termites. I love this one. It's orange oil. They make orange oil by crushing orange peel skins and extracting the citric acid. And you get that orange oil. This will kill termites and spiders, and your home will smell fresh like oranges. So there are many simple, non-toxic things you can do to reduce the amount of pesticides you're exposed to. And as we covered in the first part of this series, that's very important because these pesticides are being linked not just to cancer, but to immune suppressant, to birth defects, to hormone disorders of the hormone system in men and women. So it's very important that you take these simple actions you can to reduce the amount of pesticides you're being exposed to. So have a good day, live healthy, be well, and I'll see you in the next part series.